A millionaire abandoned his wife after she was diagnosed with cancer. What she did after recovering left him shaking. And before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. Enjoy the story. The clock on the hospital wall ticked steadily, its rhythm the only sound in the sterile, dimly lit room. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clutching the thin blanket that covered her legs. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, a constant reminder of where she was and why she was there. Her once vibrant auburn hair, now thinning, was hidden beneath a soft scarf she had tied carefully that morning. She glanced at the 4-pole beside her, the slow drip of the medication a cruel reminder of the battle she hadn't asked to fight. Across the room, David stood near the window, his back to her, staring out at the parking lot below. Emily's voice broke the silence. "David," she said softly, her tone almost pleading. He didn't respond immediately, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his perfectly tailored suit. She noticed the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he avoided looking at her. Finally, he turned, his expression unreadable. "The doctor says it's going to be a long process," Emily continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But they're optimistic. They think I can beat this." David's jaw tightened. He crossed his arms, his gaze flickering to the floor before meeting hers. "Emily, He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I don't know if I can do this." Her heart sank, a chill running down her spine. She stared at him, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "What do you mean, you can't do this?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. David sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "This isn't what I signed up for," he said finally, the words tumbling out as if he couldn't hold them in any longer. Emily froze, disbelief washing over her. "What you signed up for?" she repeated, her voice trembling with emotion. "David, we made vows, in sickness and in health. Does that mean nothing to you?" He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I have a company to run, Emily. Responsibilities. This is going to take everything. I can't just put my life on hold indefinitely." Her hands clenched the blanket tightly, her knuckles white. "So, that's it. You're walking away, when I need you the most." David's face hardened, though there was a flicker of guilt in his eyes. "It's not like that," he said defensively. "I'll make sure you're taken care of, financially, I mean. You won't have to worry about anything. Financially." Emily repeated, her voice breaking. She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "David, I don't need your money. I need you. I need my husband." But his silence said everything. David took a step toward the door, his movements slow, almost hesitant. "I hope you understand," he said quietly. "Understand." Emily's voice was sharper now, anger cutting through her despair. "Understand that you're abandoning me? That you're turning your back on everything we built together?" He paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the handle. For a moment, she thought he might turn around, that he might say something, anything, to make this right. But instead, he opened the door. "I'm sorry," he muttered before walking out, the sound of his polished shoes echoing down the hallway. The door clicked shut, and Emily was left alone in the silence. She stared at the space where he had stood, her mind reeling. The man she had built her life with, the man she had trusted above all else, had just walked away. Her chest heaved as sobs racked her body. She clutched the blanket tighter, the pain in her heart almost unbearable. But amidst the despair, a new emotion began to rise. Anger. How dare he leave her? How dare he give up on her when she was fighting for her life? Emily wiped her tears away, her hands trembling. She looked around the room, at the machines, the tubes, the Ford drip. This wasn't how her story was going to end. "If he thinks I'm going to fall apart without him," she whispered to herself, her voice filled with newfound determination, "he's wrong." The next day, As she sat through another round of chemotherapy, Emily stared out the window, her mind racing. She began to think about the life she wanted. Not the life David had abandoned, but the life she could rebuild. A nurse entered the room, her smile warm and reassuring. "How are you feeling today, Emily?" Emily met her gaze, her expression steady. "Stronger," she said simply. And for the first time in weeks, she meant it. If David thought he could walk away and leave her broken, he had no idea who she truly was. The days after David walked out were some of the darkest Emily had ever faced. The weight of his absence hung heavy over her hospital room, and the empty chair beside her bed was a stark reminder of the promises he had broken. The sound of machines humming, the sterile smell of antiseptics, and the constant shuffle of nurses had become her new reality. At first, Emily let the sadness consume her. She cried until she couldn't anymore, her chest aching not just from the cancer, but from the crushing loneliness. Each passing day felt heavier than the last, and the treatments drained her energy, leaving her staring at the blank ceiling for hours on end. But there was one bright spot amidst the darkness: Clara, the nurse assigned to her care. Clara was a whirlwind of positivity wrapped in a crisp uniform. Her warm brown eyes and no-nonsense attitude had a way of breaking through Emily's sadness. One morning, as Clara adjusted Emily's fore, she perched on the edge of the bed and said, "You know, you're stronger than you think, Emily." Emily let out a weak laugh, her voice raspy from disuse. "Strong. I can barely get through a day without crying." Clara shook her head. "Crying doesn't make you weak. You're still here, aren't you? Still fighting. That's strength." Emily glanced at her, her eyes filling with tears. "It doesn't feel like it. It never does at first," Clara replied softly, patting her hand. "But trust me, I've seen it. The ones who survive are the ones who refuse to let the pain define them." Those words stayed with Emily long after Clara left the room. That night, as she stared out the window at the city lights, she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild something out of the ruins of her life. The next day, Clara brought her a small journal and a pen. "Here," she said, placing them on Emily's tray. "Write it down. All the anger, the sadness, the fear. Get out of your system." At first, Emily hesitated. What was the point? But as the hours stretched on, she picked up the pen and began to write. The words spilled onto the page faster than she expected. She wrote about David, about the betrayal, about the unbearable weight of fighting cancer alone. And as the days turned into weeks, writing became her refuge. Her journal filled with raw emotions, but also with something new: hope. Clara noticed the change almost immediately. "You're smiling more," she said one afternoon, handing Emily a cup of tea. Emily shrugged, a small grin tugging at the corners of her lips. "I guess I'm starting to believe what you said, that I'm stronger than I think." The real turning point came one quiet afternoon when Clara asked, "What did you do before all of this? Before the treatments, before everything?" "I was a designer," Emily said softly, her eyes drifting to the window. "I used to love creating. It felt like freedom." Clara's face lit up. "Then maybe it's time to start again." Emily blinked, caught off guard. "I don't even know if I can anymore." "Of course you can," Clara said, her tone firm. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sketch pad and a set of pencils. "Here, start small. Doodle, sketch, whatever comes to mind. Just create." Emily stared at the blank page for what felt like hours. Her hands trembled as she picked up a pencil, the motion unfamiliar after months of inactivity. But slowly, tentatively, she began to draw. The first lines were shaky, but as the pencil moved across the page, something shifted inside her. Memories of her old self, the confident designer who believed in her art, began to surface. By the time she finished her first sketch, tears streamed down her face. But this time, They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of hope. As weeks turned into months, Emily's sketches evolved into full-fledged designs. She began sharing them online, hesitant at first, but the response was overwhelming. People loved her work, praising its raw emotion and unique style. One evening, as she was scrolling through her emails, a message caught her eye. It was from a popular fashion blogger who had stumbled across her designs. "Your work is stunning," the email read. "I'd love to feature you on my site. Let me know if you're interested." Emily sat back, her heart racing. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of excitement, of possibility. She replied to the email, and within days, her designs were featured on the blog. The article went viral, and soon, Emily was receiving inquiries from clients eager to work with her. Her small freelance business grew rapidly. Though she was still in recovery, the work gave her purpose, a reason to get out of bed each day. One night, as she sat by her window sketching, she whispered to herself, "This isn't just surviving. This is thriving." Clara, who had become more than just a nurse, more like a friend, visited her on her last day of treatment. "Look at you," Clara said with a proud smile. "You're a fighter, Emily. I knew it all along." Emily hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Clara, for everything." As Emily left the hospital that day, she looked up at the clear blue sky, feeling the sun on her face. She wasn't just leaving behind her treatments. She was leaving behind the version of herself that had once felt lost and broken. She whispered to herself, "If I can get through this, I can get through anything." And deep down, she knew her journey was just beginning. The hum of conversations filled the air, punctuated by the soft clinking of glasses and the occasional burst of laughter. The gallery was alive with energy, its sleek, modern walls adorned with breathtaking art. But the centerpiece of the evening was Emily's collection, a series of designs that told a story of pain, resilience, and triumph. Emily stood near the center of the room, dressed in a midnight blue gown that hugged her frame. Her hair, now grown into soft waves, framed her face, which glowed with confidence. She had worked tirelessly for this moment, and now she stood in the spotlight, surrounded by admirers and clients eager to praise her work. A tall man in a tailored suit approached her, a warm smile on his face. "Emily Weston?" he asked, extending a hand. "Yes," she replied, shaking his hand. "Your work is incredible," he said, gesturing to one of her pieces. "There's so much emotion in it. It's rare to see designs that tell a story like this." "Thank you," Emily said, her smile genuine. "It means a lot to hear that." As they chatted, Emily's eyes scanned the room, taking in the crowd. She had been so focused on her designs that she hadn't had a chance to fully absorb the moment. But then, her breath caught. Standing near the edge of the room, partially obscured by a group of guests, was a face she hadn't seen in over a year. David. He was dressed in his usual sharp suit, his posture as confident as ever. But there was something different about him, an unease, a stiffness in the way he stood. And he wasn't alone. Beside him was a striking woman with dark hair, her diamond necklace catching the light as she leaned into him. Emily's heart raced, not with longing, but with a surge of emotion she couldn't quite place. Anger, shock, perhaps a mix of both. She hadn't expected to see him again, let alone here, at her event. The man she was speaking to noticed her distraction. "Everything all right?" he asked. Emily forced a smile. "Yes, of course." "Excuse me for a moment." She walked toward the other side of the room, trying to compose herself. But as she passed a cluster of guests, her eyes met David's. He froze, his expression shifting from confidence to something she hadn't seen before, discomfort. "Emily," he said, his voice barely audible over the noise of the room. "David," she replied, her tone cool but steady. The woman beside him turned, her brow furrowing. "Who's this?" she asked, her voice sharp. David hesitated, but Emily didn't give him a chance to respond. She extended a hand toward the woman, her smile polite but firm. "Emily Weston, designer and an old acquaintance of David's." The woman shook her hand reluctantly, clearly sizing her up. "Victoria," she said, her tone clipped. "Nice to meet you," Emily said before turning her attention back to David. He looked as though he was searching for the right words, but none came. "Congratulations on the exhibit," he finally managed, his voice stiff. "Thank you," Emily replied, her tone neutral. "It's been a long road to get here." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. David opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice called out, "Emily." She turned to see Robert approaching, a glass of champagne in hand. He smiled warmly, completely unaware of the tension in the air. "You're the star of the evening. Everyone's talking about your work." Emily smiled, grateful for the interruption. "Robert, this is David and Victoria," she said, gesturing toward them. Robert nodded politely, but quickly turned his attention back to Emily. "I wanted to discuss the piece you created for the centerpiece. It's absolutely brilliant. Can we steal a moment?" "Of course," Emily said, glancing at David one last time. "Enjoy the exhibit." She walked away with Robert, her heart pounding. She could feel David's eyes on her as she moved through the crowd, but she didn't look back. As the evening wore on, Emily found herself surrounded by admirers, each one eager to praise her work. But no matter how many compliments she received, the memory of David standing there lingered in her mind. She couldn't help but wonder why he had come. Later that night, as the crowd began to thin, Emily stepped out onto the gallery's balcony, the cool night air a welcome relief. She leaned against the railing, staring out at the city lights. "Quite the evening," a voice said behind her. She turned to see Robert, his expression warm but curious. "It's been overwhelming," she admitted, a small smile on her lips. "You handled it beautifully," he said, stepping beside her. "But I noticed something seemed to throw you off earlier. Everything all right?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Just a ghost from my past," she said quietly. Robert didn't press further, but his expression softened. "Well, whatever it is, it's clear that you've risen above it. Your work speaks for itself." "Thank you," Emily said, her voice sincere. As Robert walked back inside, Emily stayed on the balcony a while longer, her thoughts swirling. Seeing David again had stirred emotions she thought she had buried. But as she looked out at the city, she reminded herself of everything she had built, of the strength she had found within herself. "This is my life now," she whispered, "not his." And with that, she turned and walked back inside, ready to reclaim the night as her own. David sat at the breakfast table the next morning, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Victoria, seated across from him, flipped through her tablet, her manicured fingers scrolling effortlessly. But David wasn't reading the business reports she had sent him, nor was he savoring the coffee in his hand. His mind was elsewhere, replaying every detail of the previous night at the gallery. She really was something, wasn't she? Victoria's voice cut through his thoughts. David blinked, startled. "What?" "Emily," Victoria said, setting her tablet down with a sharp click. "She commanded the room last night. You didn't tell me she was so impressive." David's jaw tightened. "It's been a long time since we spoke." Victoria raised an eyebrow, her gaze piercing. "Really?" "Because it didn't feel that way. The way you looked at her, it was like you were seeing a ghost." He opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Victoria smirked, her eyes narrowing. "Whatever history you two have, it's clearly unresolved." David's chest tightened. He muttered something about needing to get to work, grabbed his briefcase, and left the room, leaving Victoria shaking her head. At the office, David buried himself in his work, trying to drown out the storm of emotions swirling inside him. But Emily's face, her confident smile, her effortless charm. They refused to leave his mind. Every moment he spent with her at the gallery played on a loop, each memory sharper than the last. By lunch, he found himself scrolling through his phone, searching for her name. His thumb hovered over a news article featuring her work, the headline reading, "Emily Weston, the designer who turned pain into power." The article was a glowing piece about her rise to prominence, detailing her journey through illness and betrayal to becoming a rising star in the fashion world. David's stomach churned as he read the words betrayal and resilience. He couldn't ignore the implication. He was the man who had walked away. As the day wore on, David's focus slipped further. His assistant poked her head into his office. "Mr. Carter, the board meeting is in 10 minutes. He barely heard her. "Reschedule it," he said absently, waving her off. "But just reschedule it," he snapped, his tone sharper than he intended. The assistant left, her expression a mix of confusion and irritation. David leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. For years, he had convinced himself that leaving Emily was the right decision, that it was the only decision. He had told himself she wouldn't survive, that he couldn't bear to watch her fade away. But seeing her thriving, stronger than ever, had shattered that narrative. He thought about Victoria's words, "The way you looked at her." She was right. He had looked at Emily like he was seeing a ghost, not because she reminded him of the past, but because she had become someone he no longer recognized. Meanwhile, Emily's life continued to flourish. The success of her gallery debut opened doors she hadn't even dreamed of. She was invited to exclusive industry events, featured in major publications, and even approached for collaborations with international brands. But despite the whirlwind of activity, David's presence at the gallery lingered in her mind. She had seen something in his eyes that night, something vulnerable, almost regretful. It unsettled her. "Earth to Emily," Robert's voice broke her reverie as they sat in a meeting. "Sorry," she said, shaking her head. "I was distracted." Robert leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You've been distracted since the gallery. Want to talk about it?" Emily hesitated. Robert had become more than just a mentor. He was a trusted friend. But she wasn't sure if she was ready to open up about David. "It's nothing," she said finally. "Just a lot on my mind." "Well, whatever it is," Robert said, his tone gentle, "don't let it overshadow what you've accomplished. You're on the brink of something huge, Emily. Stay focused." She nodded, forcing a smile. But as Robert walked out of the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that her past wasn't done with her yet. That evening, David sat in his study, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face. He had spent hours reading every article about Emily he could find, scrolling through her social media, and watching interviews. One video caught his attention, a clip of Emily speaking at a design conference. "My work isn't just about fashion," she said, her voice steady and full of conviction. "It's about telling a story, about showing people that even in the darkest moments, there's light. You just have to find it within yourself." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. This was the woman he had underestimated, the woman he had left behind. And she had proven him wrong in every way. David closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, his thoughts heavy. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices. He had told himself that walking away from Emily was for the best, that it was to protect himself from the pain of losing her. But now, he realized he had only been protecting himself from his own fear. Emily, on the other hand, was determined to push forward. Late that night, as she worked on a new collection, her phone buzzed. She picked it up and saw an unexpected name on the screen, David. Her heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. But curiosity got the better of her. She opened the message. "Emily, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you. Please, just once." She stared at the message, her emotions swirling. Part of her wanted to delete it and move on, but another part, the part that still carried the scars of his betrayal, wanted answers. Emily set the phone down without replying, her mind racing. She had come too far to let David derail her progress, but she couldn't deny that his sudden reappearance had stirred something within her. As she turned back to her sketches, one thought echoed in her mind. Her past wasn't finished with her yet. Emily sat in her office, sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows as she reviewed sketches for her next collection. The buzz of her growing team hummed in the background, a testament to how far she had come. But no matter how much she tried focus, her mind kept drifting back to the message from David. Please, just once. She had ignored it for days, telling herself that she owed him nothing. He had made his choice. He had walked away. But now, with her brand flourishing and her life on an upward trajectory, she couldn't shake the question. Why reach out now? The buzzing of her intercom interrupted her thoughts. Emily, her assistant's voice came through. You have a visitor. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's urgent. Emily frowned. Who is it? There was a pause. David Carter. Her heart skipped a beat. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She hadn't replied to his message, yet here he was, showing up unannounced. After a moment's hesitation, she pressed the intercom button. Send him in. The door opened, and there he was. David stepped into the room, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something she couldn't quite place. Nervousness? Regret. He looked older than she remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes less certain. Emily, he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. David, she replied coolly, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. What brings you here? He sat down, his hands clasped tightly together as he leaned forward. I know I shouldn't be here. I know I'm the last person you want to see. You're not wrong, she said, her tone sharp. David flinched but nodded. I deserve that, but I needed to talk to you. I couldn't leave things the way they are. Emily folded her arms, leaning back in her chair. Leave what, exactly? You made your choice, David. You walked out that door and left me to fight alone. What could you possibly have to say now? David's gaze dropped to the floor, his voice faltering. I made a mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. Emily raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. And you think coming here now will fix that? No, he admitted. I don't expect you to forgive me, Emily. I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness. But I've been carrying this guilt for so long, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to make amends. She let his words hang in the air for a moment, her eyes studying him. Amends, she repeated. You think you can just walk in here and erase the pain you caused with an apology? David looked up, meeting her gaze. No, I know I can't, but I needed to tell you how sorry I am. For leaving, for underestimating you, for not being the man you deserved. Emily's jaw tightened, her emotions swirling. David, do you have any idea what it was like? Facing cancer, losing my hair, my strength, my life as I knew it, and doing it all alone? You didn't just leave me. You abandoned me when I needed you the most. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. I know, he said, his voice breaking, and I've hated myself for it every day since. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with years of pain and regret. Finally, Emily stood, walking to the window. She stared out at the city skyline, her reflection in the glass reminding her of how far she had come. David, I don't need your apology to move on. I've already done that. I've built a life for myself. A life you're not a part of. David rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. I see that, he said quietly. And I'm proud of you, Emily. You've become everything I was too blind to see. She turned to face him, her expression softening just slightly. Pride doesn't erase what you did, but I'm glad you finally realized what you lost. David nodded, accepting her words with quiet resignation. "Thank you for seeing me today. I know it wasn't easy." "It wasn't," she admitted. "But maybe now we can both move forward." As he walked toward the door, he paused, glancing back at her. "You're extraordinary, Emily. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." She didn't respond, and he didn't wait for one. He left, closing the door behind him. Emily sat back down at her desk, exhaling deeply. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her pen, staring at the sketches in front of her. But instead of returning to her work, she closed her eyes, letting the weight of the moment settle. The encounter with David had opened old wounds, but it had also brought a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. For years, she had carried the pain of his betrayal, using it as fuel to rebuild her life. And now, for the first time, she felt free. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Robert stepped in, his usual confident demeanor softening when he saw her expression. "Everything all right?" Emily nodded slowly. "Just tying up loose ends." He smiled, holding up a folder. "Good. Because we've got some exciting news. Another major brand wants to collaborate with us. They're calling you the voice of resilience." Emily let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "The voice of resilience, huh? I like the sound of that." "You should," Robert said. "You've earned it." As he left the room, Emily turned back to her sketches. She picked up her pencil and began to draw, her strokes confident and deliberate. Her past no longer held her back. It had shaped her, yes, but it no longer defined her. This was her life now. Hers to build, hers to own. The late afternoon sun poured into Emily's studio, casting golden rays over her neatly organized workspace. Her desk was cluttered with sketches, fabric swatches, and mood boards for her next collection. It was quiet, except for the soft hum of her thoughts. The past few days had been a whirlwind. Her meeting with David had reopened old wounds, but it had also reinforced her determination to leave that chapter of her life behind. Still, she couldn't deny that his words lingered, an echo of the man he once was and the pain he had caused. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away from the sketch she was working on. It was a message from Robert. "Emily, we need to talk. Call me as soon as you can. Big opportunity." She smiled to herself, grateful for his steady presence in her life. Picking up the phone, she called him back. "Emily," Robert answered immediately, his voice brimming with excitement. "I just got off the phone with one of the biggest cancer advocacy organizations in the country. They want to partner with us to design a special collection for survivors, with proceeds going to support treatment programs." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Robert, that's incredible. I don't even know what to say." "Say yes," Robert replied with a laugh. "This could be huge, Emily. Not just for your brand, but for the message you've worked so hard to share. They see you as a symbol of resilience, and they want that reflected in this collection." Emily leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. This wasn't just an opportunity. It was a chance to give back, to create something meaningful out of her own pain. "Let's do it," she said firmly. "That's what I wanted to hear," Robert said. "We'll hash out the details tomorrow. For now, just know that this is the beginning of something big." As she hung up the phone, Emily felt a swell of pride and excitement. But underneath it all, there was a flicker of unease. Could she fully embrace this opportunity without confronting the ghosts of her past? The gala invitation arrived 2 weeks later. It was an event hosted by the same advocacy group, a celebration of survivors and a platform to share their stories. Emily had been asked to speak, to share her journey and the inspiration behind her designs. On the night of the event, Emily stood backstage, smoothing the fabric of her gown. The sleek black dress fit her perfectly, exuding confidence and elegance. She clutched her speech, her fingers trembling slightly despite her outward composure. Through the curtains, she could hear the murmur of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter. Taking a deep breath, She peeked out at the audience. Her eyes scanned the room and froze. There he was. David sat near the back, his eyes fixed on the stage. He was alone this time, no Victoria at his side. His presence sent a jolt through her, but she quickly composed herself. This was her night, and she wouldn't let anyone overshadow it. When her name was announced, the room erupted into applause. Emily stepped onto the stage, the spotlight illuminating her as she approached the podium. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "My name is Emily Weston, and I'm honored to be here tonight." She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "When I was diagnosed with cancer, I thought my story was over. I thought the life I had built was gone, and for a time it was. But what I've learned is that our greatest struggles can also be our greatest opportunities for growth." The room was silent, her words resonating deeply. "My journey wasn't easy," she continued. "There were days I wanted to give up, days when I thought I couldn't keep going. But I found strength in the people who stood by me, in the creative process that became my refuge, and ultimately, in myself." Her eyes drifted briefly to where David sat. His expression was unreadable, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. "My work isn't just about fashion," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It's about telling a story of resilience, of finding light in the darkest of moments. And tonight, I stand here not as a victim of my circumstances, but as someone who chose to rise above them." When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Emily stepped back, her chest heaving as the weight of the moment settled over her. She had shared her truth, laid her pain bare for the world to see, and in doing so, she felt lighter. After the speech, Emily mingled with the crowd, receiving congratulations and heartfelt thanks from attendees. Survivors approached her, sharing their own stories and expressing how much her words had meant to them. But amidst the sea of faces, one figure stood out: David. He approached her cautiously, his hands in his pockets. "Emily," he said softly. She turned to face him, her expression calm but guarded. "David, that was powerful," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "Hearing your story, seeing the person you've become, I don't even have the words." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Is that why you're here? To tell me how impressive I am?" "No," he said quickly. "I came because I needed to hear it. I needed to understand what I walked away from." She crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "And what did you learn, David?" He hesitated, his shoulders slumping slightly. "That I was a coward, that I let fear drive me away from the one person who mattered most, and that I'll never forgive myself for it." Emily's heart softened just a fraction, but she kept her composure. "David, I've already forgiven you. Not for you, but for me. Carrying that anger would have only held me back." His eyes glistened, and for a moment, he looked as though he might say more. But instead, he nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly. As he turned to leave, Emily called after him. "David." He stopped, glancing back. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said. He gave her a small, sad smile. "I hope you keep finding what you deserve." As he walked away, Emily felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't closure. It was something deeper. It was a reminder that she had risen, not because of him, but in spite of him. Later that night, as she stood on her balcony overlooking the city, she whispered to herself, "This is my story now." And it was. The night after the gala, Emily sat on her balcony, the city lights twinkling below. The cool breeze brushed against her face, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She replayed the evening in her mind, the applause, the stories shared by survivors, and of course David. His words had lingered longer than she wanted to admit. "I'll never forgive myself for it." She had felt the weight of his regret, but she refused to let it tether her to the past. Emily had built a new life, and no apology, no matter how heartfelt, could change the choices he had made. The sound of her phone buzzing broke her thoughts. It was Robert. "Late night call," she teased as she answered. "You could say that," Robert replied, his tone light but purposeful. "I couldn't wait until morning to tell you the news." Emily's brow furrowed. "What news?" "We just got confirmation," he said. "The advocacy organization loved your speech so much, they want to fast-track the collaboration. They're offering full creative control for the collection." Emily's heart swelled. "Full control? Are you serious?" "Serious as a heart attack," Robert said, laughing. "This is huge, Emily. They're putting complete trust in your vision." She leaned back in her chair, letting the news sink in. "I don't even know what to say. This is everything I've worked for." "And you've earned it," Robert said. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we start planning." As the call ended, Emily stared out at the skyline. Her journey had been anything but easy, but moments like this made it all worth it. The next morning, Emily arrived at her studio early, her mind brimming with ideas for the new collection. The team was already buzzing with energy, the excitement palpable. "All right," she said, clapping her hands together to get everyone's attention. "This collection is going to be different. It's not just about clothes. It's about telling a story. Each piece will represent a stage of the journey. Fear, resilience, triumph." Her team nodded, their enthusiasm matching her own. They began brainstorming, sketching, and discussing materials, the room alive with creativity. As the day wore on, Emily couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. This was her purpose, not just creating beautiful designs, but using her work to inspire others. But as the hours ticked by, her thoughts drifted back to David. She hadn't expected him to show up at the gala, let alone admit his regret so openly. Part of her felt closure, but another part wondered if he had truly understood the impact of his choices. Meanwhile, David sat in his office, staring blankly at his computer screen. The past few weeks had been a blur, his thoughts consumed by Emily. Seeing her at the gala had stirred something deep within him, an ache he hadn't felt in years. Victoria had noticed the change in him. "You've been distracted," she said one evening as they sat at dinner. "I've had a lot on my mind," he replied, avoiding her gaze. She sighed, setting down her fork. "If this is about Emily, just say it." "I'm not blind, David. I saw the way you looked at her." David didn't respond. He couldn't deny it any longer. "You need to figure out what you want," Victoria continued, "because I won't sit here and play second to someone who's clearly still in your head." Her words stung, but they were the truth. David had been living in the shadow of his past, unable to move forward. As the weeks passed, Emily poured herself into her work. The new collection began to take shape, each piece infused with emotion and meaning. The advocacy organization was thrilled with her progress, and media outlets were already buzzing about the upcoming launch. One afternoon, as she finalized a design, her assistant knocked on the door. "Emily, there's someone here to see you," she said hesitantly. Emily glanced up. "Who is it?" "David Carter." Emily sighed, setting down her pencil. "Send him in." David entered the room, his posture uncertain. He looked around the studio, taking in the sketches and fabrics that surrounded him. "This is impressive," he said, his voice quiet. "What do you want, David?" Emily asked, her tone firm, but not unkind. He took a deep breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. About everything. About us." "There is no us," Emily replied, crossing her arms. "I know," he said quickly, "and I'm not here to change that. I needed to say thank you." "Thank me?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "For showing me what strength looks like," he said. "For proving that even in the face of everything, you could rise. It's inspiring." Emily studied him, her expression softening slightly. "David, I didn't do any of this for you. I did it for myself. And you should be proud of that," he said. "But seeing you now, it's made me realize how much I've been running from my mistakes, from myself." I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you that you've changed me." Emily sighed, her emotions a mix of frustration and sympathy. "David, I'm glad you're finding clarity, but you need to understand something. I'm not the same woman you left behind. I've built a life that has nothing to do with you." "I know," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "And I don't want to take anything away from that. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Finally, Emily nodded. "Thank you for saying that." David smiled faintly. "Take care of yourself, Emily." "You too," she replied. As he left, Emily felt a strange sense of peace. The chapter with David was finally closed, and she could move forward without the weight of his shadow lingering over her. That evening, as she stood in her studio, staring at the finished designs for her collection, Emily felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Her journey had been filled with pain, but it had also been filled with growth. She picked up one of the dresses, running her fingers over the fabric. It was a piece she had designed to represent resilience, a testament to the strength she had found within herself. As she hung the dress on the rack, she whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." And it was. The launch of Emily's new collection was set to be the most significant event of her career. The collection, titled Threads of Resilience, had already garnered attention from major media outlets, fashion critics, and advocates alike. Each piece represented a stage of her journey: fear, strength, healing, and triumph. And Emily had poured her heart into every stitch and sketch. The venue for the launch was an ornate hall in the city's art district. High ceilings adorned with intricate chandeliers cast a golden glow over the room, while the walls were draped in soft fabrics that mimicked the designs from her collection. As the final touches were being made, Emily stood in the middle of the room, taking it all in. Her team buzzed around her, making sure everything was perfect. Robert approached, holding a clipboard, his expression a mix of pride and excitement. "Emily," he began, his tone warm, "this is going to be a night to remember." She smiled, her nerves fluttering beneath her confident exterior. "It feels surreal," she admitted. "A year ago, I was sitting in a hospital bed, wondering if I'd even make it. And now, this." Robert placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You earned this. Every bit of it. Tonight isn't just about fashion. It's about everything you've overcome." Emily nodded, her chest swelling with pride. She had turned her pain into something beautiful, something that could inspire others. As the doors opened, guests began to trickle in, their excited chatter filling the room. Emily mingled with journalists, industry leaders, and supporters, each interaction reminding her of how far she had come. But as the evening wore on, one moment stood out. A young woman, no older than 20, approached Emily hesitantly. Her short hair and the faint scar above her eyebrow suggested she had been through her own battles. "Ms. Weston," the woman began, her voice shaking slightly. "Please call me Emily," she said warmly. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman continued, her eyes glistening with tears. "I've been following your story for months. I'm a cancer survivor too, and seeing what you've done, how you've turned your life around, it gave me hope when I didn't have any." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She reached out, taking the woman's hands in hers. "You're stronger than you know," she said softly. "And your story isn't over. You've already proven how resilient you are." The young woman smiled, her tears spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered before walking away. Emily stood there for a moment, her heart full. This was why she did what she did, not for the accolades or the success, but for moments like this. Later in the evening, as the lights dimmed and the music softened, the models began to walk the runway. Each piece in the collection told a story, the fabrics and designs reflecting the emotional depth of Emily's journey. The audience watched in awe, their expressions a mix of admiration and emotion. When the final model walked the runway, the room erupted into applause. Emily stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding as she faced the crowd. She took a moment to soak all in before speaking. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the wave of emotion threatening to overcome her. "This collection isn't just about fashion. It's about finding strength in the darkest moments. It's about turning pain into power." The room fell silent, her words resonating deeply. "There was a time when I thought my story was over," she continued. "But I learned that every ending is just a new beginning in disguise. This collection is my story, but it's also a story for anyone who's ever felt lost, broken, or defeated. It's a reminder that resilience isn't just about surviving, it's about thriving." The audience erupted into applause once again, and Emily felt tears prick her eyes. She had never felt more seen, more validated, more alive. As the event wound down and the guests began to leave, Emily found herself alone in the quiet hall. She walked along the runway, running her fingers over the fabric of one of the designs. This moment felt like the culmination of everything she had fought for. Robert appeared beside her, his hands in his pockets. "You did it," he said simply. Emily smiled, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "We did it," he nodded, his expression proud. "What's next for Emily Wesson?" She turned to face him, her eyes gleaming. "I want to keep pushing forward. This is just the beginning. There's so much more I want to do. More stories to tell, more lives to touch." Robert grinned. "I have a feeling you'd say that." Later that night, Emily returned to her apartment. She kicked off her heels and curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, her thoughts drifting. The launch had been a success, but more than that, it had been a celebration of how far she had come. Her phone buzzed with messages, congratulations from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had seen her work. But one message stood out. It was from David. "Congratulations on tonight. You've built something truly extraordinary. I'm proud of you." Emily stared at the message for a moment before setting the phone down. She felt no anger, no resentment, only peace. David was a part of her past, and that was where he would stay. She looked around her apartment, at the sketches pinned to the walls, the books stacked on the coffee table, the life she had built from the ashes. "This is my story," she whispered to herself. And as she closed her eyes, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't defined by what she had lost. She was defined by what she had gained. Her journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.